Okay. Um, so I wanted to talk about this post from Luke. It's not that I'm picking on this um influencer, Bitcoin influencer. I like him. Actually, he's a nice guy and he's doing a great job in being an influencer, being part of a Bitcoin family. The problem is that he represents what I call a group of Bitcoiners that they call the expo bros. Okay, so they are so focused on this idea that Bitcoin is going to be exponential, is going to explode, is going to do crazy stuff, because they cannot deal with the idea that Bitcoin is a power law. So they are trying to do everything possible, even to misunderstand or to misinterpret what the power law is about. But is first of all, is the truth. Second, represents actually the best possible path for Bitcoin to grow and do all the things it needs to do. They don't understand that the exponential growth is not a good thing for Bitcoin, and they tried to explain it so many times, but it it goes over their heads, because on these very childish desire for this exponential growth. And you can see here, right? So he posted like he made at least 3, 4, 5 videos where he always talk about how the power law is going to be broken, how it's not going to happen, how in certain currency, a lot of misunderstanding and misconception and even fallacy. But here he's talking about something that I spent a lot of time myself working on. I just published a paper, basically an article. It's going to be a paper about how the majority of the Bitcoin community misunderstand adoption. There is a lot of literature that shows adoption in social networks, and Bitcoin is a social network, follow power laws. It's not me saying that, it's the literature. Okay. I posted, there are several papers that I will show you in a moment, because I'm still going to show you what Luke is saying, uh, that make actually a big point about uh, power laws being all over the place in social network, and now the idea that it follows this S curve is incorrect. It's not true. Okay. In fact, I actually showed him what, first of all, the data say. So people, let me let me analyze this. Okay. So first, let's see what Luke says, because he actually made a video. So I'm going to and say, oh, nobody. First of all, in the video, say nobody ever showed this. No, it's not true. I spent years. In fact, one of my first article in 2013 was about the relationship between um, price and addresses, okay, and trying to understand the role of addresses. Addresses and transactions are measures of activity in the network, so they can be understood as proxy for adoption. And I will say something more general about this. But so he has this weird graph, long-term projection of global Bitcoin adoption. I don't know where it takes it. Source, Blockware. Okay, here, the source, Blockware Solutions. It's a mid-up curve. It's a mid-up curve. First of all, from the graph, we have no idea how good the fitting is. It's just this small little component here, right? And so we have no clue how good this adoption here. Percent of population using Bitcoin. It's a mid-up curve, okay? It doesn't try um, to explain how they derive this result, from which data. We could try and go and see what they did, but it's a worthless exercise. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the data. The only data that we really have, it's addresses and transactions. So you can take this information from the on-chain data that are addresses and transactions, and then do all kind of manipulations of the data and derive the number of Bitcoiners. Let me say this, it's not necessary. Why not? Because in physics, this is why physics is such a superior science relatively to anything else. We always focus on what are the measurable, what can I really measure, right? There is no point to come up with derived quantity. Maybe if you are really after that for whatever reason, but in terms of adoption, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's an interesting thing to know how many Bitcoiners there are, but you will arrive always to some kind of estimate, and so that number is going to be always in a range. Is going to be always an estimate, and it's not going to help us to make any further um, inference about how the adoption influence price. What about focusing addresses? Addresses itself, you don't have to do any manipulation. They are a measure anyway of adoption because more people are using the network, more addresses are produced. And all the pushback about using addresses like, well, some people open 345. Okay, so this person acts like if it was 345 people. Then there is the person that open a wallet, try to do a transaction, it maybe one time a transaction of 0.001 Bitcoin, and then it never did anything. That person is not really a participant in the network. So we can focus directly on addresses, and you can always normalize the addresses in terms of some kind of estimation of people, like I did here. I did the same thing. I took the number of addresses. I use his estimate. I think it's more. I have some reasons, but again, these are not really valid reasons to think it's more like close to 70 million than 40 million. But it's okay. We can take 40 million and then normalize it, normalize the addresses to that number, and then here you have your Bitcoiners. I say it's not a measure of that because, again, all the criticism, but it's why your fake measure based on some kind of estimate that I don't know comes from different things. Addresses is of what we have, okay, and we can show because I did all this work recently that actually, if you are interested in how some measure of activity of a network influences the price, we can do it directly from addresses, and there is so much more information. And you don't have to debate on which form are using, which kind of manipulation, and the data shows that it's a damn power law, like everything else, or everything else in Bitcoin is a power law. It's not an S curve, and in particular, it's not this kind of S curve it is showing here, where basically we are talking about an exponential growth, because this kind of S curve is the result of integrating basically what is called the famous bell curve. So you have in mind a model where there is a kind of an average amount of adoption that has not been reached yet, and then we are at early stages, and then there will be a flattening because everybody's adopting Bitcoin and so on. So first of all, you have to realize in a graph like this, I did graphs like this. This is my first model actually. In 2013, I posted a Reddit where I used this model, okay, and it gave me crazy results when I did it at that time. And since then, I abandoned it. It's not a good model for Bitcoin. And but you have to realize that a graph like this is not one graph; it's an infinite number of graphs, because you don't know. That is one of the problem with these models. You don't know where this flattening occurs, right? You don't know when it's occurring. You don't know what is the final number. Here they are assuming 90% adoption. We don't know that. It could be 50%. It could be 40%. And then these dates are pretty ridiculous because by the time, like in the next 20 years, 30 years, Bitcoin will be it will become a standard, becomes a standard, and then everybody adopts it. By definition, if it becomes the standard, there is no more and more population that adopts it. If a world like a big huge country like United States adopts Bitcoin, then it becomes like the monetary system of the world, and so they can have their own local currencies. It doesn't matter that all the international transactions will be done with Bitcoin. It doesn't matter how many people more are going to adopt it. This is a completely ridiculous chart. It means nothing. 2015, 2016. By then we will have a technological singularity. It's almost impossible to predict what happens 100 years from now. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous chart in so many ways. I don't know why people do things like these. It's not really giving us any useful information. It's actually misleading in a way. Okay, so we need to focus on addresses, and so these are all what we have. We have addresses, and we can learn a lot from addresses. Okay, we can learn a lot of information, uh, and I just posted this article where I was able to derive the price from addresses using network properties, showing that the adoption follows networks, uh, like many other type of networks is a power law, and then from that we can derive actually using network equations the price itself. You can read my article. Actually, I showed him here. I think I posted it in. I made a link. Oh, so okay. First of all, this one, right? Before we arrive to my article. So this is in fact, my article is actually based on this paper and other papers that study real scientists and not somebody random person on the internet that does some rough calculation, basically taking what he thinks is the number of Bitcoin right now by the days. It is also wrong because, of course, in the beginning it was a much smaller number and now it's bigger. So, in fact, if you follow the power law, right now we are about 22,000 people, not 7,000 people. We are 22,000 people per day adopting Bitcoin because it's it's a non-linear process. Today is much more than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But it doesn't follow an exponential, it follows a power law. And for example, with the power law, because it's a power law of a cube, means that if we go more 15 years, the 2 to the cube, it's 8. So we're going to have 8 more uh, people, let's say, more nodes in the network. And that doesn't seem a big number, but remember, the price goes with the square of a number of users. That is the other beautiful thing about network properties, that we don't need to have so many people adopting Bitcoin for the price to go up, because the valuation of a network, it's the square of a users. So that is again ignored by this S curve because it doesn't tell you anything about the value. It doesn't make this connection. Why, if you're thinking in terms of networks that Bitcoin is, then everything links together. Now, in this paper, look what we say very clearly. We observe power law growth dynamics for both nodes. Nodes will be the people, and links. And links is the connection between them, but actually it's the price. It turns out that it's directly related to the price of Bitcoin. A fact that breaks the textbook model featuring sigmoid curves. Sigmoid curves, S curves, this is why we call them S curve, because it forms a sigmoid. It's not really an S, it's what is called a sigmoid curve. So they tell you directly that the evidence, and they study several real case social networks, they don't follow the sigmoid curves. So, but you need to read the literature. You need to be knowledgeable about these things, okay? Not just make some website with some people making. So it's other people making some made up information in their head, because they think they understand the topic when they don't. They didn't study it, they didn't go deep in the literature, the scientific literature, and they make up stuff. And there is a lot of stuff like this on the internet. And people criticize me because they say, okay, don't focus on your stuff, don't tell what other people wrong. It's an important function, and you can criticize much you want. I'm going to point out when people say things that are incorrect, because it's important. It's part of my job as an educator. I created this job for myself, that I'm going to educate people on Bitcoin and the truth about Bitcoin. And so if Bitcoin doesn't follow an S curve, and people from Fidelity, I don't care who it is, it can be Sailor, it can be Satoshi, if it is not true, it's not true. The beauty of Bitcoin is that we have the data. It's giving us the data, it's giving us this gift. We look at the data like real scientists, like Galileo told us to do. Okay, so we don't make up data, we don't make up stuff, because we like exponentials at any cost, and we impose exponentials on everything. If it is, and you can say you are doing the same thing with power laws. Yeah, based on science, based on the evidence. So if there are other people that are now affiliated with me, they say, look, we studied power law, we studied network dynamics in real cases, and all of them show up like power law. In fact, it's kind of breaking. If there is anything that breaks, Luke, look at this break. See what it breaks? The sigmoid is broken, the exponential is broken, and the evidence says so, right? And here is my article, Modeling Bitcoin Adoption and Price. So go on my hacks and look for this article. It's here, and you can read it. And I show actually in the article that about Bitcoin is like these other networks, okay? And I show the evidence. So in fact, we can click on the article. So let's look at the article. So if we scroll down, okay, so I write all the information. I'm using all the math because the beauty of this math, I will make a better video on this particular latest development in my work. But basically, from the article that I just showed you, what they did, they wrote this what are called differential equations. What are differential equations? This is what we use in physics all the time. Our equation that describe how something changes, right? You see this quantity here, the n dt, is the change. And it's a beautiful equation because in this equation, what do we have in this equation? This equation is showing us how, if you have a network, the nodes that are the number of people. So the number of people that Luke was saying are 7,000 per day, etc. This equation tells us exactly, actually, how the nodes in the network change, how they become larger and larger or smaller and smaller, depends if the network is growing or shrinking. In this case, with Bitcoin, it's growing, of course. And notice, I'm going to break you down this equation a little bit so you can understand it, right? In the next couple of minutes. So uh, what this equation is about, it's telling us that the change in the number of nodes that are basically, you can use the addresses as a proxy, but if you want to think about the people behind the addresses that are doing all the transactions, it's the Bitcoiners, right? This N. That is a function of time. This is what it means, T here. And then it depends on growth parameter, this beta. It's how fast the network is changing, basically the rate of adoption. Here is some kind of limiting number, like this floor, this ceiling that we are going to reach. Now, the beauty of this is that you don't have to assume anything. You can make it big, large, and if there is any sign from the data, because in the end you take this equation and try to make it work with the data that you have, right? If there is any sign that we are tapering off, that we are coming close to some kind of limiting value, then it will give you the value, what is that value. But if there is no sign, in theory, you can put a really large number. So it doesn't limit you in terms of creating basically an infinite number of models, right? So you can make an arbitrary large number that means we are far away, or a number that makes sense, right? So maybe you put the entire population of the world or whatever, but it doesn't really influence the shape if that number is very big, okay? So, and then you have this time. So the inclusion of this time and this little constant theta is very nice because by changing this theta, right, you can actually have different cases. Like, for example, if theta is 1, this equation will lead to power loss. If it is 0, it will lead to exponential. And then you can have anything in between, like S curves, logistic curves, basically almost any curve that you can imagine they can describe. So it's a very general approach. It doesn't imply power law. A power law can be a solution, but the exponential can be a solution. Sigmoid can be a solution. Logistic curve, that are basically like power laws, but they are tapering off. It's a particular case where you have a power law that is tapering off eventually. And probably Bitcoin will be there if we don't get adopted, if we don't get Bitcoinization before it's flattening out. Once it's adopted, then there is no power law. There is nothing. There is like a fixed exchange between the dollar and Bitcoin. It's a different story. It's the end of these models, because we don't need any models anymore. But before we arrive there, this equation is very beautiful because basically encompasses all the different cases. And you can go from one case to another. And then you fit the data, and the equation will tell you which one of these parameter works best for the data that you are available. Okay. So it basically you are agnostic in terms of which model will work best. And you allow as a solution all of them. Another thing to notice, look at how basically the change itself depends on the current number, this NT, of Bitcoiners right now. That is the beauty of this type of processes they call iterative. And this is how you get power laws. And even exponential, because an exponential growth like that will also depend on the current state of the people. So more people there are right now, more there will be next. So the big difference between the exponential and the power law is that the exponential is if we eliminate this parameter t, the way to eliminate it is to having theta being equal to zero. Because if you have t to the zero, then anything to the zero is one. So basically, it's almost like it disappears, right? Because you take the rate of change divided by one. And if you have a constant rate of change, where let's say I double or triple or whatever every day, or a given amount of time, I go to exponential. Like for example, S2F, supposedly we go up 10 times every 4 years, that leads to an exponential. So this equation allows for an exponential to be there, right? And then if it is one, then basically it's kind of like an exponential in the sense that we double, triple, whatever this beta is, the beta rate of change. And the number of new Bitcoiners depends on the number of Bitcoiners now, right? It makes complete sense because that means we more of us, more we can orange peel, right? And then more people come in, we can orange peel even more. It's a beautiful, beautiful equation. Uh, and until right, this difference basically is zero because if this number approaches n, that is the final number, then this difference is zero. So this is why it flattens out, right? It starts to flatten out. The change is zero. There is no. This is what this component means. That this change is proportional to how many people we still have to orange peel, right? Once we orange peel everybody, then there is nothing to orange peel. So if this difference is zero, then this change goes to zero. That means the curve itself, the total curves flattens out. You see how this works? Math is not difficult once you start. Even this very scary equation, it's actually relatively easy to understand if you spend the time to understand. This is why understanding is so important, okay? And so this equation, the beauty of this equation, that can encompass all the different cases. And this other equation, then, it's the links. So this equation is a little bit more complicated. I'm right now, we can do another video, but basically it's the number of connections that you have in this network, how all the different nodes are connected, right? So there are some people like Luke or me that have this social platform. We have a lot of connections. When there are some people, there are fewer. And so basically this is calculating some kind of like an average number of connections. You can do it. It will be very interesting to calculate actually how many different nodes and the distribution of these nodes. We can do this later. We can study and go deeper later. But this calculates the average number and is proportional, of course, to the number of nodes. And we can go deeper and try to understand the equation. But for now, also because I'm trying to keep this within a small amount of time, so it's digestible. It's telling how the connections are changing, right? And so what did I do? I ran this simulation because this you run it in a loop where you start with a certain number, like one. You can say there was a Bitcoin, it was only Satoshi in the beginning, and then he orange peel few people around him, and they orange peel and orange peel, right? And it goes up. So you do this in a computer simulation where you take basically the output and you add it to the previous input. And because if you want to know the next value, you just take the current value and you add the change, right? So you do this over and over and over again. In fact, people can reproduce this. It's not very difficult. You can do it in a for loop. And then you basically calculate your model. The difficulty here is to match the model, because what are the parameters that I'm going to use? What am I going to use for theta? What am I going to use for beta? What am I going to use for n? And so the way you do it, it's I mean different methods, but they propose in the paper one method. It's a kind of sophisticated way of finding and training your model to uh, find these parameters. But when I did it and I ran the same approach, what I found out that theta is basically one, close to one. So it gives us a power law. And you see, the power law is a red line. It matches almost perfectly. There is no S curve there. It's a power law. The data say so. And then the beta in this case is 3. And so you see, these are curves that you see here are not the usual regression that we do, that we did it to discover this phenomenon in the first place. Now we are going back to this, we are getting the same results, doing something much more sophisticated. We are allowing for all possible solutions, and the solution we get, it's the power law, because this is what the data does. And then the beautiful thing, when you go to the links is the price. It's the power law in price. And you can say, what about the bubble? Well, if I change this little parameter alpha, something that I want to explore even more, okay? And this is actually what is called the network identification. Basically, is a relationship between the nodes and the connections. That is another power law. And you see how the real data looks like, how the solution of a model of a simulation looks like. And then if I introduce an oscillation in this parameter alpha that is usually a constant, but I make it periodic, where the property of a network change, right? Because maybe during the bubble there is more activity, there is more connections, there is more enthusiasm, etc. I get the bubbles. And it can be refined, where maybe we can change the heights, all kind of things like that. But you see how doing real science leads you to solutions, to understanding, etc. And then the other thing, because I have a few minutes, I want to keep this within 30 minutes. The people that wrote the paper went deeper, and they started to apply this method to all these examples. We could make much more. These are Chinese, so they focus mostly on Chinese social networks like WeChat and Weibo, and they had all the data about the nodes. These are the nodes, the number. So this is the usual log linear chart where the C looks like the rainbow chart. But these are all power laws. They make this big claim that real social networks, they don't behave like S curves. They behave like power law. I know the look will hate this, but that is what reality says. You see, they are all power laws. And the Enron looks weird because, okay, what the Enron has anything to do? They have a lot of their emails, so because it was a bankruptcy, so they have access. They had to make the emails public. They have access to the emails, and so they can study them and see how much connections they were. See, there is a break. There is a here, because there was the bankruptcy, started to do something weird, right? So we could see if something like that happened with Bitcoin. But so far, Bitcoin belongs to all these other social networks where power laws are supreme. They follow power laws. So we cannot make up stuff and say they follow S curve. They follow power laws, okay? So that is how you do science. This is how you improve knowledge with the truth, not with stuff that is made up. Now, the next thing I want to do, I'm going to make some kind of live indicator about Bitcoin where we can measure all these parameters. We can measure the theta, maybe we can report theta on a daily basis or weekly basis and say, okay, if it changes, then it becomes an exponential or becomes tapered. We can report beta, we can report theta, all these parameters, and have like kind of a state of a network, okay? And so we know what it's doing. All right, so I hope you enjoy this presentation, and I see you later.